When people hear the word Taliban, most imagine sudden violence, extremism, and chaos appearing out of nowhere. But history is never that simple. Movements like this are not born in a vacuum. They grow slowly, silently, fed by anger, grief, humiliation, and loss. And one of the most powerful fuels behind the Taliban's return to power was something rarely discussed honestly: civilian deaths. Not statistics on a chart, not numbers in a report, but real people, fathers, mothers, children whose lives ended in ways that reshaped an entire nation's psychology. This story does not begin with the Taliban themselves. It begins in ordinary Afghan homes. Mud brick houses at the edge of villages. Children playing in dusty courtyards. Families sharing bread and tea. After long days of farming, for decades, Afghanistan has been a battlefield for global powers. But for civilians, war was not ideology. It was survival. Every explosion, every raid, every airstrike chipped away at trust, dignity, and hope. When foreign forces entered Afghanistan after 2001, the mission was framed as liberation: destroy terrorism, protect civilians, build democracy. On paper, it sounded clear. But on the ground, war is never clean. Intelligence is imperfect. Decisions are rushed. Fear dominates every operation. And slowly, quietly, civilians began to die. A night raid in a village based on faulty intelligence. An airstrike aimed at militants that hit a wedding instead. A checkpoint shooting because a car did not stop quickly enough. Each incident was later explained as a mistake, collateral damage, or tragic error. But to Afghan families, there was no mistake. There was only a dead son, a shattered home, and a silence that followed. At first, many Afghans still believed justice would come. They waited for apologies, for accountability, for someone to be punished. Sometimes there was an investigation. Sometimes compensation money arrived, a few $1,000s handed to a grieving family, as if life could be priced. But rarely was anyone held responsible. Rarely was dignity restored. This is where the emotional shift began. Every civilian death planted a seed. Not immediately visible, not explosive, but deep-rooted. Grief turned into resentment, resentment into anger, anger into a search for meaning. And in war-torn societies, meaning is often offered by those who speak with certainty. The Taliban understood this psychology better than anyone. They did not need sophisticated weapons at first. They needed stories. They went to villages after bombings. They sat with families who had lost loved ones. They listened. They cried with them. And then they spoke words that were simple, powerful, and unforgettable. They killed your people. We will protect you. This was not about religion at first. It was about justice, revenge, and dignity. Imagine a father who lost his daughter in an airstrike. He complains to local authorities. Nothing happens. He approaches foreign officials. He is ignored. Months pass. The pain remains. Then one night, men arrive quietly. They speak his language. They know his village. They tell him they are fighting those responsible. Suddenly, anger has a direction. This is how insurgencies grow, not through ideology alone, but through emotional recruitment. As civilian casualties increased, trust in foreign forces and the Afghan government collapsed. Villagers began to see soldiers not as protectors, but as unpredictable threats. Checkpoints became symbols of fear. Drones in the sky became reminders that death could arrive without warning. Every time a civilian was killed, the Taliban gained something priceless: legitimacy in the eyes of the wounded. Western military reports often focused on numbers: insurgent leaders eliminated, targets neutralized. But the Taliban focused on stories. They named the dead. They shared photos. They spread narratives through mosques, whispers, and later, social media. One dead child could be worth more than 100 propaganda videos. And here is the most uncomfortable truth. Even Afghans who disagreed with the Taliban's ideology began to tolerate them. Not because they supported extremism, but because they hated humiliation more. Humiliation is one of the strongest political forces on earth. When a foreign soldier kicks down your door, when your family is searched publicly, when elders are disrespected, when apologies never come, something breaks inside a society. People stop believing in promises. They stopped believing in reforms. They stopped believing only in power. The Taliban offered power, however brutal it was. As years passed, civilian casualties continued despite improved technology. Precision weapons were supposed to reduce deaths, yet mistakes kept happening. Each mistake erased years of goodwill. Each apology sounded hollow. Each investigation felt like a delayed tactic. The Afghan government, heavily dependent on foreign backing, became associated with these deaths. To villagers, it was no longer foreign forces alone. It was their government allowing this to happen. Corruption, weak justice systems, and warlord politics made things worse. Meanwhile, the Taliban adapted. They avoided mass civilian killings early on in certain areas. They punished criminals quickly. They settled disputes faster than government courts. This contrast mattered. A farmer does not care about global politics. He cares about safety, about his children returning home alive. When faced with two forces, one that accidentally kills civilians and never fully answers for it, and another that promises order, the choice becomes tragically simple. Civilian deaths became the Taliban's strongest recruiting tool. Young men who lost brothers joined not because they loved jihad, but because they wanted revenge. Mothers who lost sons stopped warning others about the Taliban. Elders who once opposed them stayed silent. Silence itself became support. Over time, fear shifted. People feared the airstrikes more than the insurgents. And that psychological shift changed everything. By the time foreign forces tried to change tactics, focusing on hearts and minds, the damage was already done. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild in war. The Taliban did not need to defeat the strongest military in the world directly. They needed to outlast it emotionally. Every civilian death shortened patience abroad and deepened rage at home. This is why, years later, when the Taliban began advancing rapidly, entire areas collapsed without major fighting. Soldiers surrendered. Villages opened their gates. Not because the Taliban were loved, but because the alternative had failed them too many times. And this is the hidden truth, rarely discussed openly. Civilian deaths did not just weaken the enemy, they strengthened it. War planners often talk about strategy, resources, and leadership, but they underestimate memory. Communities remember every funeral, every destroyed home, every unanswered cry. Those memories travel across generations. If you truly want to understand how the Taliban rose again, you must look beyond ideology and battlefield tactics. You must look into the eyes of those who buried their loved ones and were never heard. This is not a justification, it is an explanation. And explanations are uncomfortable because they force us to confront consequences. In the next part, we will go deeper into how propaganda transformed grief into loyalty, how drones changed village psychology forever, and why winning wars without winning trust is impossible. Before we continue, remember this: understanding the past is the only way to prevent repeating it. This normalization of loss is one of the most overlooked reasons the Taliban were able to rebuild their strength quietly, patiently, and effectively. They only needed enough people to stop resisting them. Neutrality helped them. Silence helped them. Fear helped them. The Taliban exploited this expertly. They portrayed themselves as locals, not outsiders. They blended into communities. They understood customs, languages, and tribal dynamics. Compared to distant aircraft and foreign soldiers, they felt familiar. Every civilian death widened this emotional gap. International forces tried to counter this with development projects, schools, roads, clinics. Fighters were often introduced as someone like you, someone who lost a brother, someone whose home was destroyed, someone who had nothing left to lose. Once people feel they have already lost everything, fear loses its grip. The Taliban also learned patience. They avoided direct confrontation when it didn't serve them. They waited. Every year, foreign troops stayed increased fatigue back home. Every year, civilian casualties continued strengthened the Taliban narrative. Time was on their side. International audiences grew tired of the war. Media coverage declined. Political priorities shifted. But in Afghanistan, the war never paused. It continued quietly, shaping attitudes. By the time peace talks began, the Taliban were no longer just an insurgent group. They were a parallel authority in many regions. Civilian deaths had helped clear their path. Not because it was always accurate, but because evidence seemed to support it. Even Afghan soldiers felt this contradiction. Many came from villages affected by civilian casualties. When people stop believing in the cause they are defending, defeat becomes inevitable. Both outcomes made long-term peace harder. The Taliban understood this generational shift. They targeted young men who had grown up knowing nothing but war. For them, fighting felt normal. This is how cycles of violence sustain themselves. It's important to understand that many civilian deaths were unintended. But intention does not erase impact. Impact shapes reality. Wars are not won by intentions. They are lost by consequences. By the late 2010s, the Taliban no longer needed to convince people they were right. The Taliban walked into cities that had already surrendered emotionally. There is another layer to this story that rarely gets discussed openly, and it may be the most dangerous of all: silence. Not the silence of the battlefield, but the silence of the world. Civilian deaths in Afghanistan did not just fuel anger locally. They were amplified by global indifference. And that indifference became part of the Taliban's most effective narrative. When civilian casualties happened, they often appeared briefly in international media, then vanished. A headline for a day, a short segment on the news. Then attention moved elsewhere. But for Afghan families, the story never ended. The world moved on. They could not. This imbalance between global attention and local suffering created a powerful emotional divide. People began to ask a simple question: if our lives mattered, why does no one stay to listen? The Taliban answered that question for them. They framed global silence as proof that Afghan blood was cheap, that international laws were flexible, that human rights only applied selectively. This message resonated deeply with communities who felt abandoned not just by foreign forces, but by the entire world. Media narratives matter more than most people realize. When civilian deaths were reported as collateral damage, language itself caused harm. That phrase reduced human lives to technical side effects. It sounded clean, professional, emotionless. For those living the reality, it sounded insulting. Every time such language was used, it created emotional distance. The Taliban exploited this distance, presenting themselves as the only ones willing to call the deaths by their real names. They named victims, they visited families, they performed funerals. These actions were not only symbolic, they were strategic. In contrast, official responses were bureaucratic. Press conferences, investigations, reports for grieving families. This felt impersonal and cold. This emotional gap mattered more than military strength. Another crucial factor was how civilian deaths blurred moral boundaries. When people repeatedly see innocents die without accountability, they begin to question moral authority. Who has the right to decide what is justified? This moral confusion weakened resistance to extremist narratives. The Taliban did not need to argue they were morally perfect. They only needed to argue that no one else was either. Once morality becomes relative, power fills the vacuum. Civilian deaths also affected how communities interpreted intentions. Even when foreign forces tried to protect civilians, repeated incidents made those intentions seem irrelevant. People judged systems by outcomes, not promises. Over time, many Afghans stopped distinguishing between mistakes and malice. Both felt the same in practice. This emotional exhaustion made people more willing to accept any force that promised an end to uncertainty. The Taliban's messaging evolved alongside technology. As mobile phones and internet access spread, videos and images of civilian casualties traveled faster. These were shared privately, through messaging apps, beyond the reach of official counter-narratives. A single image could undo months of diplomatic effort. The Taliban understood virality before it became a mainstream concept. They relied on raw emotion, not polished production. Shaky footage, crying relatives, destroyed homes. These visuals felt authentic. Authenticity beats authority in the digital age. Meanwhile, official narratives were cautious, legalistic, and delayed. By the time a statement was released, emotions had already hardened. Civilian deaths also fractured alliances at the local level. Tribal leaders who cooperated with the government lost credibility when they could not protect their people. Some were targeted by the Taliban. Others withdrew support quietly. Neutrality became survival. In this environment, even humanitarian organizations struggled. When civilians died near aid operations, suspicion spread. Aid workers were accused of being linked to military actions. Trust eroded further. This made it harder to deliver help, which increased suffering, which further strengthened Taliban narratives. A vicious cycle. Another rarely discussed impact was how civilian casualties changed the meaning of sacrifice. When foreign soldiers died, they were honored publicly. When Afghan civilians died, they were often anonymized. No names, no faces. This perceived hierarchy of grief mattered deeply. People noticed whose lives were mourned and whose were footnotes. Over time, resentment grew. The Taliban weaponized this resentment skillfully. They spoke about dignity, about equality of blood, about reclaiming value. For populations who felt invisible, this message was powerful. It's also important to understand how fear reshaped moral choices. When civilians feared airstrikes or raids, they avoided interacting with government forces. This reduced intelligence sharing, reduced cooperation, reduced security effectiveness. The less information forces had, the more mistakes happened. The more mistakes happened, the more fear grew. Again, a self-reinforcing loop. The Taliban benefited from this dynamic without directly causing it. As civilian deaths continued, Afghan society adapted psychologically. People lowered expectations. They stopped demanding justice. They focused on survival. In such conditions, ideology becomes secondary. This is how extremist groups thrive, not because people fully believe them, but because belief becomes less important than relief. The Taliban promised relief through certainty. Harsh certainty, but certainty nonetheless. Another layer was religious framing. Civilian deaths were sometimes interpreted through spiritual lenses. Martyrdom, destiny, punishment, protection. The Taliban integrated these interpretations into their messaging, offering meaning to otherwise senseless loss. Meaning is a powerful coping mechanism. When people can explain suffering, they can endure it. The Taliban provided explanations when no one else did. At the same time, international discourse often focused on strategic objectives, not human consequences. This further deepened the emotional divide. Afghans felt studied, not understood. When people feel like subjects instead of participants, resentment grows. By the time international leaders acknowledged the scale of civilian suffering more openly, trust had already collapsed. Apologies felt late. Reforms felt cosmetic. The Taliban's resurgence was no longer preventable through messaging alone. What makes this story especially important is that it challenges comfortable narratives. It forces us to accept that power alone cannot secure peace, that technology cannot replace trust, that intentions do not outweigh experiences. Civilian deaths transformed the conflict from a fight against extremism into a struggle over dignity. Once dignity became the core issue, the Taliban gained an advantage, because dignity is not negotiated through policy. It is earned through respect, and respect, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim. In the next part, we will examine how international withdrawal plans, peace negotiations, and strategic miscalculations accelerated the Taliban's return, and why civilian suffering made resistance collapse so quickly. As international attention slowly shifted away from Afghanistan, decisions were being made behind closed doors that would define the country's future. Peace talks, withdrawal timelines, strategic handovers. On paper, these were steps toward ending a long war. On the ground, they were interpreted very differently, especially by civilians who had already lost trust. For many Afghans, peace negotiations felt disconnected from reality. The same people who had suffered the most were rarely represented at the table. Victims of civilian casualties were not asked what justice meant to them. Their losses were acknowledged in speeches, not in power. This absence mattered. When civilians saw talks happening without accountability for past deaths, it sent a clear message. Suffering was negotiable. Closure was optional. Justice was secondary to convenience. The Taliban understood this message immediately. They framed negotiations as proof that violence worked, that patience paid off, that the world would eventually talk to those who refused to compromise. Civilian deaths, once again, became evidence not of tragedy, but of leverage. At the same time, foreign military operations were scaled down, but not fully stopped. This created a confusing environment. Civilians still faced danger, but now without the promise of long-term protection. Uncertainty replaced fear, and uncertainty is often worse. Communities began preparing for the worst. Local leaders made quiet deals. Families relocated. Soldiers questioned orders. Everyone sensed that something was ending, but no one knew what would replace it. Civilian casualties during this period felt especially cruel. If the war was ending, why were people still dying? This question haunted communities. Each death during the withdrawal phase reinforced the idea that Afghan lives were expendable even at the end. This perception further weakened morale and trust. The Taliban used this moment perfectly. They positioned themselves as inevitable. Not just strong, but destined. Their messaging emphasized patience, faith, and historical cycles. Empires come and go. Locals remain. This narrative resonated deeply with people who had watched foreign powers arrive and leave for generations. Another critical factor was how security forces responded psychologically. Many Afghan soldiers had personal connections to civilian casualties. They were fighting in areas where their own relatives had suffered. As withdrawal became real, these soldiers asked themselves a painful question: who am I really fighting for? When loyalty weakens, structure collapses. Reports of surrenders and negotiated handovers were not just tactical decisions. They were emotional ones. Soldiers chose to go home rather than die for institutions they no longer believed in. Civilian deaths had already fractured that belief. Meanwhile, urban populations watched this unfold with disbelief. Cities had benefited from development and relative stability. But even there, civilian casualties left scars. Attacks in markets, schools, and hospitals reminded people that safety was fragile. As the Taliban advanced, fear spread faster than facts. Rumors filled information gaps. Stories of revenge killings circulated. Some were exaggerated, some were real. But fear does not wait for confirmation. In this climate, resistance requires trust, and trust was already gone. The Taliban's return was not driven solely by force. It was enabled by exhaustion, by resignation, by a sense that no one else could or would protect civilians effectively. Civilian deaths had taught people a hard lesson. Promises change, but consequences stay. International leaders often expressed surprise at how quickly everything collapsed. But for many Afghans, it felt predictable. The collapse was emotional before it was military. Years of unaddressed suffering had hollowed out institutions from the inside. Another overlooked element was how the Taliban adjusted their behavior during the final phase. In many areas, they avoided large-scale violence. They offered amnesty. They promised order. They restrained fighters in public. This restraint was strategic. It contrasted sharply with memories of airstrikes and raids. For civilians desperate for calm, even temporary restraint felt like relief. Civilian deaths had lowered expectations so much that the absence of violence felt like peace. This is a dangerous dynamic. When people accept less harm as progress, long-term freedom becomes negotiable. The Taliban benefited from this shift in mindset. They also capitalized on the failure to address trauma. Years of war had left deep psychological wounds. No nationwide reconciliation. No truth process. No collective healing. Unprocessed trauma does not disappear. It hardens. The Taliban offered a simple outlet for this trauma. Authority, structure, certainty. Even fear can feel comforting when chaos has lasted too long. Civilian deaths were central to this psychological landscape. They symbolized helplessness, and people will trade many freedoms to escape helplessness. As power changed hands, many civilians did not celebrate, but they also did not resist. Silence filled the streets. Life continued cautiously. This silence was misinterpreted by some as acceptance. In reality, it was survival. The cost of years of civilian suffering was now fully visible. A society too tired to fight, too wounded to trust, too cautious to hope. This is what prolonged civilian casualties do. They do not just kill people. They reshape behavior. They change what feels possible. The Taliban did not need universal support. They only needed enough people to stop believing in alternatives. And civilian deaths had already done much of that work. As the dust settled, the world debated responsibility. Who failed? Who miscalculated? Who should have acted differently? For Afghan civilians, these debates felt distant. Their losses were not theoretical. They were permanent. The Taliban resurgence was not an accident. It was the outcome of choices layered over years. Choices that repeatedly placed civilians at risk without meaningful accountability. Understanding this does not mean endorsing the Taliban. It means recognizing how power grows in the shadows of suffering. In the final part, we will confront the hardest question of all. What lessons were ignored? What could have been done differently? And why similar mistakes continue to happen in conflicts around the world? When the fighting stopped and the headlines faded, one truth remained unspoken in most global conversations. Wars do not truly end when weapons fall silent. They end or continue inside the memories of those who survived. In Afghanistan, civilian deaths ensured that the war never really ended at all. It simply changed form. The Taliban's return shocked the world, but for many Afghans, it felt like the final chapter of a story already written. Years of loss had prepared them emotionally for disappointment. Hope had been replaced by caution. Dreams had been downsized to survival. This is what prolonged civilian suffering does to a society. Each apology without justice widened the gap between words and reality. Each investigation without accountability weakened faith in institutions. Over time, people stopped asking for answers. Silence became a shield. The Taliban filled that silence with certainty. Another critical lesson is that military success means nothing without moral credibility. This is why the Taliban's ideology, however extreme, found space to grow, not because it was attractive, but because alternatives felt hollow. People choose certainty over promises when promises fail repeatedly. Civilian deaths also exposed the limits of external intervention. No matter how advanced or well-funded, foreign forces cannot fully understand local pain. Without deep cultural accountability, even good intentions can cause harm. Another uncomfortable reality is how quickly the world moved on. New crises replaced old ones. Attention shifted. Funding declined. Afghanistan became a reference, not a responsibility. For civilians, this confirmed their deepest fear. They were alone. The Taliban leveraged this abandonment. They presented themselves as permanent when others were temporary, as inevitable when others were conditional. Permanence matters deeply in societies shaped by war. Civilian deaths also taught future generations a dangerous lesson. Power belongs to those who endure the longest, not those who promise the most. This lesson does not disappear. It spreads. That is why Afghanistan's story matters far beyond its borders. Similar patterns are visible wherever civilian lives are treated as acceptable losses, wherever apologies replace accountability. Wherever silence follows tragedy, the cycle is always the same. First, civilians are harmed. Then, trust erodes. Then, resentment grows. Then, extremist narratives fill the void. Breaking this cycle requires more than policy changes. It requires humility. It requires listening to victims before speaking to strategists. It requires placing human dignity at the center of decision-making. Afghanistan reminds us that every civilian death carries consequences far beyond the moment. Consequences that ripple through families, communities, and generations. Consequences that shape political outcomes long after the smoke clears. The Taliban did not simply rise because they were strong. They rose because others failed to protect what mattered most. This does not mean the future is fixed. It means the cost of ignoring civilian lives is now undeniable. If there is one takeaway from this story, it is this: wars are not won by defeating enemies. They are won by protecting people. When protection fails, power shifts often to those willing to exploit pain. As viewers, as citizens, as humans, understanding this truth matters. Because the next conflict is never far away, and the same mistakes are always waiting to be repeated. If we only look at maps and numbers, we miss the human story. If we only listen to official statements, we miss the quiet anger growing beneath them. Afghanistan's experience is a warning written in loss.